almost every man I've spoken to, when they talk out loud about their father wound and even grandfather wound, there's wars involved, men going off to war, losing fathers in war. There's often addiction involved in there. There's also often physical abuse, abandonment,
poverty, like all sorts of
poverty,
things.
extreme poverty, hard labor. And it makes you wonder how any of our fathers or grandfathers grew up with any kind of personal adjustment whatsoever.
And they didn't have the resources like we do today, or the stigma was so heavy around, getting help and mental health and
Back
therapy.
then, you just survived.
You just grit your
And
teeth.
you went off to war because that's what you did.
Yeah.
And, you got married and had kids because that's what you did.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, it amazes me that our fathers have done as well as they did.
As great as my dad was, and he is a great man, he could never provide all of the experience of life that some of these other older men have been able to encourage me and guide me through.
You want to riff on that just for a minute?
I do want to riff on that.
Because one of the things I've been telling men, because I've been working with men for 30 years, and almost every guy's got a father wound. A handful of guys I work with say, yeah, my dad was a good man. I have great respect for him. But there's always a but. Mm-hmm. He fell short in some way. And I've really come to tell men, by default, every father is going to be inadequate. That's just the reality of it. My father was in many, many ways. I was towards my son. And the fact of the matter is that our ancestors were raised by, just a tribe of men, a team of men. If you look at throughout human history, for about 1.5 million years, we all grew up in tribes. So we were initiated by a tribe of masterful men who'd been initiated themselves by masterful men. So we had, 20 dads, 50 dads, 100 dads. And even if we just go back 100 years ago, before, we became so industrialized, so many families moved off the farm into the city, if you and I had grown up 100, 150 years ago, we would have grown up probably around our grandfather, uncles, cousins, just men would have surrounded us in the extended family. And we would have learned from all of those men. Now we got a dad, probably not learning from our grandfathers, from our uncles, from our cousins, and certainly not from a tribe of good men. And so a single man who was himself not initiated by good men, he's got his own addictions, his own distractions, his own worries, his own traumas, his own, demons. And so that one person by nature is going to be by default less than ideal. And so I think a lot of men, that's one of the tough one for guys to get over is wherever their father was less than perfect. And that's what they tend to focus on, the less than perfect part, not the part that he did contribute that was of value. And I know I went through all of that as well. I didn't talk to my dad for 15 years.
Wow.
And what shifted it is when I began to focus on what I was grateful for. And there was a lot to be grateful for. And I started focusing on that and reconnected with him, and then came to the realization and acceptance, he had his limitations, as we all do. He had his emotional intelligence, his social intelligence. He just had limitations. And once I accepted that, when he had a stroke and passed away, I was really at peace with that. And really for many years now, we've been working on just building a committee, like what we all need of just good men in my life, that sometimes they parent me, sometimes they're just my companion. So, I've just built that crew. So every dad's going to be, less than adequate. And even whatever I've contributed to your life and your development, there's still gaps.
Of course.
There's still holes. There's still, John's, contributed a lot. And you'll continue to find other men that make up for what our fathers couldn't do, which then lets us just have gratitude for what our fathers did do.
Yes. Actually, when I first got into this work, like many men, I held my dad in really high regard, and I still do, but I was resistant to speaking anything poorly of him, even though there was obviously a lot of flagrant things that I was like, that wasn't good or right, but I had this protection around it that I didn't want that idealism, because we look up to our fathers, to be shattered or to think of any less of him, almost like I would be disrespecting him in some regard. And then I did a lot of work around that and really started to see the ways that I had been dropped. And I think that brought up some like resentment, kind of. I didn't go no contact with him or anything, but really like, hey, what the fuck? Right. And then recognizing, I've come full circle to your point, where it's just like, I love him for everything that he's offered me. And it's unrealistic to put that amount of pressure on one person, or that amount of expectation for them not to raise you with their own wounding. Because I know when I have a son at some point, I would love to have a son if that happens, that I'm going to fuck it up too. Like, I'm going to have things in places that I don't meet him. And even going into fatherhood with that expectation perhaps will help me find other resources and other men that can help guide him that aren't me, and not to be jealous about that or not to be upset about that, but actually that's a real bold fatherhood leadership move to make, where it's like, I can't teach you everything. Because I even think in ancient cultures, it was often when men were initiated or boys were initiated into manhood, it was like their uncle and their whatever that took them away to do that. It wasn't, their father often wasn't a direct part of that process, from things that I've heard. I don't know the validity of that, but because he actually needs to be separated, not only from the mother, but the father as well, to become his own man rather than just in the image of his father, which so many men try to replicate, for better or for worse, with the shadows and with all the stuff.
As a marriage and family therapist, one thing I realized over the years is most people they try to parent either exactly the same way their parents did, or the exact opposite of the way their parents did. And I always would tell parents, that's not the most effective way to parent, either doing the exact same or exact opposite, because every child's unique, and every child, has their unique needs. And I'd also tell every parent, you're going to fuck your kids up. Mm-hmm. Everybody does. And the real issue is not how do you fuck your kids up, it's how do you recover from those fuck ups. Because I've worked with people in their 60s and 70s who have parents still living. And I've asked them before, if your father came to you today and said, I'm sorry, I see the mistakes I made, I was less than an ideal parent, I love you, I'd like your forgiveness, but I just want you to know how much I love you. I've asked people in their 60s and 70s, how would you respond? And they break into tears. Yeah. So it's never too late to recover from those pieces. And, I still, when stuff comes up with my son, he's 38 now, I still go to him and I'll ask him, how did that affect you? Because I know that was less than an ideal situation. And I think because he knows he and I can talk about any of those things, it doesn't stick in him. If you don't know you can talk about it with your dad or your mother, whatever, it stays stuck. You feel like, I can't let it out. I can't tell them. And so even just giving your kid access to say, we gave our kids permission. You can say, you can't say, I hate you, Dad, but you can say, Dad, I'm mad at you. And we taught them how to express the emotion without, doing the things that sever relationship.
Yeah. Feeling, I think, safe enough to bring anything to your parents, which is a pretty unusual dynamic to have in a lot of families. At least it was in mine. Where
it's not real common.
My way is kind of the way it is, and any argument about that, I'm already in the wrong position as child, right? And so meeting more eye to eye on a real level feels something that I definitely want to imbue in the relationships with my future children. I'm curious, when you were speaking, you said you didn't talk to your dad. Did you get to reconcile that before he passed, or was that something you had to work out on your own?
Yeah, I'm grateful that I reached that place of being at peace before he had a stroke.
Okay.
That was in 2009. And I didn't see him frequently. And when I did see him, we'd go get a donut and a cup of coffee, and he'd kind of tell me the same stories he told me the last time. And he wasn't that old. I think he was 78 when he passed away. Yeah. That's getting up there. But, yeah. But in a way, that was good to kind of just see this is the limit of his bandwidth. This is as far as he opens because he doesn't know anything beyond this. When I kind of see that just same thing, every 6 months when we get together and have a cup of coffee or whatever, it was the same. I thought, that's all he's capable of. And I had compassion for that. And I wasn't condescending in any way. I just thought that's
kind of
all he's got.
He's at. Yeah.
That's all he got.
And love him for that.
And, and if that's all he's got, that's all he's got. How can I expect more if he doesn't have more than that? And that really is what gave me the peace and let me just focus on what I was grateful for. And around this time, I got connected with a cousin of mine, also a Dr. Glover, Danny Glover. So, I got a famous cousin. But he's in Tennessee. I didn't even know he existed until I was in my 50s because his father and my father are brothers. But his dad was 20 years older than my dad. So he'd already left the house before my dad was even born.
Wow.
So my dad didn't grow up around his older brother. So I didn't even know this cousin existed. But he also shared with me what my father's family was like. My father, of course, was the youngest by far of his siblings. But apparently my grandfather was very physically abusive, grandmother, very unloving. And my cousin's father was physically abusive. A sister of theirs who I had met, an aunt of mine, another cousin, her daughter, told me that her mom was physically abusive. And my dad wasn't. I mean, he was abusive verbally, and which is painful. But when he passed and I spoke at his memorial, it's just a small memorial in my folks' home, I was the only one of my 4 siblings that wanted to say anything about my dad. And he could be a difficult human being. He could be very angry and bitter and shaming and moody and self-centered and all the things I tried not to be, but found out, I'm more like him than I'm different.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that I was able to say about him in all of the things about him that was difficult to be in relationship with him, he had upped the game of what he got from his father. And I said, I hope maybe that in some ways I'd up the game of from my father. And at that time, my son, my granddaughter was probably 3 at that time, and I just see him being the greatest dad. So it was really good to know what my father's childhood was like, and to know what he dealt with, and that also gave me more forgiveness. And I know in John's program we've done things around the father wound, and I've led these kind of exercises with people where I go with guys and we go back and imagine their father at a young age. What was he like in his 30s? What was he like in his 20s? See him. What clothes is he wearing? What was he doing? How was he living? What was it like when he was, early 20s, teenager, early adolescent, little boy, baby? And start picturing your dad as a baby. He was a helpless, perfect little, baby at some point. And almost every man I've spoken to, when they talk out loud about their father wound and even grandfather wound, there's wars involved, men going off to war, losing fathers in war. There's often addiction involved in there. There's also often physical abuse, abandonment,
poverty,
extreme poverty, hard labor. And it makes you wonder how any of our fathers or grandfathers grew up with any kind of personal adjustment whatsoever.
And they didn't have the resources like we do today, or the stigma was so heavy around, getting help and mental health and therapy.
Back then you just survived.
You just grit your teeth.
And you went off to war because that's what you did.
Yeah.
And, you got married and had kids because that's what you did. And so in a way it amazes me that our fathers have done as well as they did, considering maybe what their fathers went through and their grandfathers went through. I think most of us grow up with so many comforts. We just go, oh yeah. This world isn't that tough. But you just go back pre-World War II. It was tough. It was a tough life.
Yeah, I had an experience. I did the Hoffman process. Are you familiar with it? It's kind of
I've heard it, but I've never done it.
Yeah, it was pretty profound. It was basically lineage kind of healing, and it's all about your father and mother and your family of origin. And you do a lot of visualization meditations, and one of them is that exact thing, kind of this regressive thing where you're having a conversation with your parents when they're children, and you also do it as your child. And it's really interesting because you recognize, like you said, I've never thought of my mom or my dad as a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old where they're just helpless. And then
dealing with whatever they dealt with.
Exactly. And some things I know that they dealt with and some things I didn't. And one of the things that I was struggled with was both my grandparents have passed now on my father's side. And they were very, very, for the most part, very sweet and kind people. And I wonder how my dad got some of these tendencies from them. But what I recognized during that process was, you're different when you're raising kids at 30 than when you're a grandparent at 65, 70. My dad has softened a lot in his elder years, and how he treats his grandchildren is totally different than how he parented us because he softens. And we forget that too. Our grandparents were young and working through their stuff, and we're going through all of those types of challenges that you mentioned, perhaps even more so in that generation, a couple generations back. And life tends to, some people get very calcified, but generally people soften around their children, around their grandchildren as they get older. But we don't see that. So we're like, why were my grandparents so kind? And then, my father was kind of a jerk sometimes. And now I'm seeing he's very soft, and my brother is kind of like being a jerk sometimes, and then he's going to soften. And it's all this, it's all perspective, right? Yeah. And it takes some humility and also some width to go back and really look like, oh yeah, man, me trying to raise 3, my dad had 3 kids at 34, how old I am now, I would have been a couple years old, and doing what he had to do to put food on the table and everything he had to go through. And me imagining holding all that and a marriage and everything else and all these responsibilities, of course, man, he did a great job. Right? There's so much to be thankful for and grateful for. I had food, I had clothing, I was safe, I had, education, he took me on amazing trips all the time and stuff like that. And that was 90% of the experience was positive. But we have this tendency, I think it's our human nature, to get so, especially when you get into personal work and development work, you can get so singularly focused on all the ways you're traumatized and hurt and how things went wrong. But I think as I get older and get more perspective, I'm immensely grateful. And I talk to other men who don't have good relationships with their father, and it really shows. Some of them are, you can really tell how there's this missing or this wound in them that is really impacting their relationships with other men, of course, with women, or the projection that they put on other men as a father wound and stuff like that. I noticed that really big when we were in EMLT. Some guys you could see how they were just blasting John with this father wound, and they were so unaware of it, right?
And it's helpful though, believe it or not. For example, the whole kind of psychoanalytic view of therapy is that the therapist is this kind of blank slate, and he plays that role so people can project all of that stuff. So, as a leader, as a coach, and you may not be at an age yet where you start getting that, but at some point, as an authority figure, you'll start getting people's authority figure issues. Yeah. And, I have to always remind myself when, I trigger somebody and throughout this weekend, a lot of guys came up to me and asked me questions and, shared how I'd helped their life. And, a couple people came up to clear with me. And I was always so grateful when they did it, because it's good practice, number one. And where else can they go do that? And I know one guy came to clear with me because I've been married 3 times. And he says, I don't think you respect the sacredness of marriage. And I go, tell me what that means to you. So we talked in a great conversation, and I think it was really meaningful and helpful that he could come clear that out, because again, we are going to project that stuff. And I've worked with men long enough. You see it, you're going to keep seeing it. I think the very fact that you guys got 40 guys together in a weekend workshop, and I'm going to guess the majority of them did not know what they were getting themselves into. No. What was this about? And this is one of the reasons I love working with men, is I just assume most guys have father wounds. We project that onto other men. I've heard men say that for so long. I don't feel safe with men. I talked to one guy this weekend. He goes, I'd rather be at a co-ed workshop. I connect better with the feminine energy and that. He goes, I don't feel any connection here with these guys. And I said, well, try this. Try, as you look in men's eyes doing the practice, see the feminine in them and see if you can create a sense of polarity of your masculine with their feminine. And he and I chatted a couple times, and by the end of the workshop, he goes, yeah, this was worth the investment. I'm glad I did it. I still don't think he'd probably sign up for another men's program, but I've just seen that for so long that we do project whatever our father wound is onto other men and assume other men, and we'll always find somebody, oh, that guy right there, and we don't even know we're projecting onto him. But the beauty of it is, if there's a clear container, if there's a process for doing that work, and I shared, and I've always joked, after my first year in the men's program where I met you.
I was going to ask you about this. I know exactly where you're going because I wanted you to share this.
I quickly realized just how judgmental I am. And, I often lead with, I'm a judgmental motherfucker. And now I can watch it. I can just watch my judgments. And I know the kind of context they're often going to come up in. And I'd get in the program, and, if it didn't really matter what it was, judgment would come up about different men in different ways. This was during the time when a lot of men had the big bushy beards and just, they spent more time on their hair than the average woman. And, you can see my judgments coming out. and I'm going.
Easy to say when you don't have any hair. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Fuck. So I'm going, what the fuck is this? All these really soft young dudes and all this, And I noticed me having judgment, and I noticed it would leak out in some pokes, in some jabs, and just avoiding. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And I think what happened is maybe I did, through time, a practice with, some of these people and looked at them eye to eye. And there's one guy, I won't mention his name, but he was my first year, so you would have met him, and then second year as well, all tatted up and just kind of a grizzly guy, lives out in the woods.
I was thinking about this, man.
And I mean, he triggered me so much on that first retreat that we had. And then when we were out in the desert, and, by the time that year was over, every time I'd see him, I go get a hug and feel his beard rub my face. And I just love this guy. And, like with my father, I could see his shortcomings, his struggles, his demons, and just loved him anyway. So I quickly learned through that first year is that if I notice a judgment coming up of any kind, whether it's about his beard or how long it takes him to groom his hair or his, Burning Man clothes that he wears or, whatever it is, I would make a point to go get to know him, either get on Zoom with him or at a workshop, just go talk to him, just find out who he is with curiosity. And I found that quickly, and you can see it like in these weekend workshops even. Everybody's there hesitant, and by the time the weekend's over, they don't want to leave. They're hugging each other. It's like they've been frat buddies for 40 years. And it is just so amazing how these processes can speed that up. But also, I think just a willingness to go, if I've got judgment, I'm going to own my judgment and go and find out who this man really is. Because I'm sure my judgments don't match who this person is. And yeah, he's human. He's imperfect. But it's funny how I can go from being judgmental and not even, want to give a guy time of day to just considering him a deep friend that I'm grateful for, that, I just want to hug every time I see him. So why I love men's work is that you can go do that. And I'll watch men go from being kind of scared rabbits at the beginning of a program like you guys ran, and at the end of it, they're big, they're strong, they're connected, they're holding each other, they're laughing, they're loving each other. And I know I just get so nurtured from that, of just having that depth of connection with men. That's why I keep coming back and saying yes to every opportunity to go connect deeply with men. And now, doesn't matter where my father was imperfect. I have so many good men in my life that they level me up in ways that my father couldn't. And again, even, the things that we don't know or don't see about our fathers. I had judgment of my dad that he was a mailman his entire life. He was going to school to be an engineer, and then my sister's born, then I was born, so he couldn't do that. So he got a job at the post office. And he never went into management, did the same job for 30 years, retired at 55, couldn't wait to retire. And I thought, he was an intelligent man. Why did he sell himself short? Why didn't he live up to his potential? And it wasn't until just 2 or 3 years ago it dawned on me. He came to like 80 to 90% of the ball practices I had. Soccer, football, baseball, from 8, 9 years old, pee-wee baseball through high school. He often had to work Saturdays, so he couldn't like coach, but and would miss some games. But he was at all the practices. I hear so many guys say, "My dad never came to one of my games.
Busy building the thing that
never came to one of my games." And
yeah.
it dawned on me, okay, maybe he kept a job that he never liked, that let him get off work at 3:30 in the afternoon. He could make my practices, and he took us camping and he took us fishing. And I thought, this judgment that I had of why didn't he live up to his full potential, maybe he sacrificed that intentionally, consciously, because it was important to him to be a family man and be involved with, his children's activities. And he was. I had a lot of friends, their dads never came to anything. So even the judgments we have, sometimes we got to flip them around and go, wait a minute, I had judgment of this, but the truth was he sacrificed his purpose because it was more important to him to have that sense of being a family man and a father, maybe ways that his father wasn't.